And all the participants of these events got to hear the message of the President of the Russian Federation, and in Minsk of the deputy head of the State Duma, of Mr. Abramchenko, about the history of this event and the achievements of the international cooperation within the Union State, was presented at the celebratory event in the embassy of the Belarus and Russian Federation on March 31st, and on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. And of course, from all of us, we send heartfelt wishes to all the citizens of Russia and Belarus on this great event. We wish subsequent development, strengthening of sovereignty and authority on the international stage, as well as flourishment, success, great health, happiness, well-being, as well as faith in themselves and their own powers, because together we can achieve anything. And that's the only key to our success. And now we move on to the situation that is obvious to us, but for many of those in the world minority, to them it's not as obvious. The situation around the Ukrainian crisis, the Kyiv regime, country has lost its sense of self-preservation, and it's trying, no matter the price, to undermine. And before that, they tried to claim victory, to impose a defeat, or whatever their wording was. But right now, they're desperately trying not to claim victory over someone, not to strengthen their own positions, but to undermine the Russian-American dialogue that has launched, using terrorist methods, striking energy infrastructure objects daily. Why am I paying special attention? Because starting on March 18th, it's starting on this date. It's in action the mutual on the strikes on the energy system, and starting on this day, supposedly, because it's not being followed by the Kyiv regime, we see targeted attacks on the objects of the energy infrastructure of the Russian Federation, that despite the statements of the Ukrainian side about supposedly military necessity, are clearly of the provocative and demonstrative nature. Facts speak for themselves. Over this period, there was over 30 strikes against our objects of energy infrastructure in Belgorod, Bryansk, Zaporozhye region, in Krasnodar Krai, Kursk and Kherson regions. And it's important to point out that all those strikes have been launched using Western weapons that are used for terrorist attacks against our civilian infrastructure. Just a few examples. For those who continue to live under the illusions, so they could get a real picture, on March 31st, 10:08 a.m. in Zaporozhye region, after the attack of the Ukrainian UAV, there were at least 4 UAV launches against the electrical station in Novogorivsk. This is the Guptavia Energo. There was an electric cut of the home users in the 2 residential villages in the Tokmakovsk region at the same day at 11:38 in Belgorod region, after the strike of Ukrainian UAV against the transformatory station in Smorodina. A high voltage line has been cut, with electricity cut for over 1,200 consumers in the Grivoronsk region. On April the 2nd, the Ukrainian armed forces used UAV to strike the gas station Svatova in LPR, and the Kyiv regime, feeling their coming defeat, trying at any price to provoke an escalation and to attract their British and European patrons in a direct confrontation with Russia. And obviously, they have no result. As the Russian Ministry of Defense points out, all the objects are securely protected. There is no threat to the population. But that's the idea of the Kiev regime, not to cause direct damage, but create new pretext for another wave of hysteria in Western mass media and try to undermine the dialogue that has already started between Moscow and Washington. So the actions of the Kiev regime are not just war crimes, but it's a deliberate course to undermine any peaceful initiatives. Just take a look. Over the last 3 years, they've tried everything, and I don't just mean the Minsk agreements that we tried to get from the Kiev regime over 7 years, but even over the last 3 years, even direct negotiations with the representatives of Bankova, despite how obvious it was at the moment, that chance was used. Direct negotiations did take place. They took place, they lasted for several rounds. There were also numerous statements, regular statements of Moscow. As for the diplomatic settlement is our preferred way of action. There were also constant reminders of the Russian Federation that the Kiev regime has prohibited themselves having any negotiations with our side. We've tried everything. And whereas in the West, as if under the order that only in the battlefield a solution could be found and this issue, this crisis could be settled, when they understood that that which they bet on of the victory of the Kiev regime will never see the light of day, that's when they've changed their tune, tried to talk about the peaceful negotiations. The Kiev regime did, once again, everything in their power to undermine them at the stage of the idea and up to the point of any kind of realization, and even any reassurances that were given by Zelensky. As for them following this condition, that has been undermined on the exact same day. Russia will not fall prey to any provocations, but responsibility for the consequences of this destructive policy will be fully on Bankova and their mentors, who continue to follow the craziest criminal actions of the Bankova. I would like to say a few more words around the Ukrainian crisis. The Kiev regime, as we've already mentioned, contrary to the commitments it has made, is still striking our energy infrastructure. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, from March 26th to 31st this year, the targets of the AFU's artillery and drones were the facilities of Rossetti Center in the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk region, an electric substation in the Zaporozhye region, ground equipment in the Glebovsky underground gas storage facility in Crimea, the Saratov oil refinery, etc. Among the targets, they already include the gas metering equipment and the Suja gas metering station in the Kursk region. After the attack of the Ukrainian Armed Forces on March 28th this year was destroyed. On April the 2nd, the AFU launched a drone strike on the Svatova gas distribution station in the LPR. So we're providing factual information that showcases how the Kiev regime is undermining exactly what it publicly agreed to. Moratorium on launching strikes on the energy civil infrastructure. We would like to emphasize once again that the continuing terror of the Kiev regime against the Russian energy sector only confirms its lack of commitment. Bankova lacks the political will for peace. They're still determined to escalate the conflict and are ready to any provocation to undermine efforts to achieve any settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. And this is not the only crime. Against the background of renewed dialogue between Moscow and Washington, the Kyiv regime, with the support of its so-called European partners, is not reducing the intensity of strikes against civilian facilities on Russian territory.
The number of attacks against civilian population of the country does not decrease. Since March 24th to March 30th, 118 civilians have been targeted by attacks. 14 of them died, 104 were injured, including 3 minors. The majority of those affected have been in the territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the Kherson region. At this period, in Horlovka, for example, the Ukrainian strike resulted in the injuries of the TV channel in Donetsk. In the DPR in Lysychansk, a 14-year boy was injured during a strike from the multiple launch missile system in the village of Mikhailovka. A female doctor and a driver of the ambulance have been attacked in the village of Petrovka. And also in Gorlovka, a 13-year-old boy and 4 other civilians were attacked with cluster munitions. And on the 1st of April, the AFU attacked a regular bus with passengers at Victory Square and at the center of the city. 16 people were injured. An 86-year-old woman died as a result of a UAV strike against a civilian house in the Verkhnya Krynica village on the Zaporozhye region. The Rostov region was attacked from air on April 2nd. As a result of this, a house in Taganrog was damaged and 1 person was injured. In the Kursk region, the retreating Ukrainian Nazis in their impotent rage are attacking the civilians with UAVs. We see new facts of deliberate mining of the locations adjoining the civilian areas. We see that we heard some news that Ukrainian militants in Bucha offered locals bread, and then in cold blood they murdered those civilians. We find new victims in wells, in gardens, houses, and cars, but it's not all, it's not everything. The Ukrainian Nazis are profiting of this. Just to think of it, you cannot stoop any lower. But of course, there is always potential for more depravity. We see some auctions or selling stuff that was stolen from the civilians in the Kursk region. They are selling goods that has been stolen from the region. They've been marauding the Russian region, and the AFU militants resorted to every means possible. The Kazachya-Lukne village in Kursk region saw the fact that the locals were not allowed to bury their loved ones, whose bodies were strewn across the streets, until they got the information that the Western journalists were having to visit the village. Then the remains were cleared out with shovels. Another evidence of the participation of foreign mercenaries in combats in the border region in Kursk was the discovery of a corpse of one of the bandits with an insignia of a British Marine school called Gornestown Sail Training. It's a wonderful advertisement for this facility. We see such insignia being issued to the alumni of this educational establishment, numbering among their alumni such personalities as Prince Philip and King Charles III. We are not seeing any reaction from the Western NGOs and media outlets who were running with the pictures of boys and girls claiming that there was human rights violations in some corners of the world. Where are all the NGOs from the Western Europe? Where are they? It's our common living space. It's our continent where neo-Nazis are massacring the civilian population. All those NGOs and media are silent. They are worthless. But our law enforcement agencies are continuing their work. The Russian courts are continuing to sentence the Russian criminals for the war crimes they've committed. 23 militants of the terrorist organization Azov Battalion were sentenced to prison. 6 militants of the 129th Separate Brigade of the Territorial Defense of the AFU, Sergei Blashenko and Sergei Bohonko, received 15 years each. Nikolai Koronenko, Artur Volkov, and Maxim Hadzev received 14 years, and Vitaly Chupin received 13 years in prison. The mercenaries from the UK, France, and Georgia, Good Fraser Owen, Arthur Tremblay, and Nicholas Cheredze, who were fighting for the AFU, have been sentenced in absentia to 14 years in prison each. The Soldier of Fortune for the United States have been also sentenced. Robert Anthony Vardaro was sentenced to 7 years in prison. They have been all called. A search was called for them internationally. And also, this concerns the case of a legionnaire from Brazil, Nicolas Cha. The Britons and the EU functionaries continue to try to consolidate Europe's position in support of Ukraine. The March 27th European Summit, uniting countries joining the coalition of the willing, was organized to serve this goal. This coalition was organized by London a month ago to form a so-called peacekeeping contingent to be sent to Ukraine. But we see that probably this whole operation has come to a dead end. President Macron of France has declared of the creation of the Coalition for Action for Sustainable and Durable Peace, which intends to reunify those who demonstrated their willingness to express unity in building the peace through force. In other words, the same coalition of willing supports the continuation of war, but under another disguise. I have an impression that those names of some groups and social networks with some questionable content for people with some problems with mental problems, they have nothing to do with peace and peace efforts. Those are the breeding grounds for the group of the war party that tried to inflict a strategic defeat upon Russia, as they said themselves. Now, understanding that they have failed in the task, they are trying to create some sort of plan, and they are creating and multiplying the corresponding organizations. We also see reports that the German parliament has prepared a legal framework for increasing military aid to Kiev in 2025 by 3 billion euros. I just wanted to ask them the question if they were aware of the situation with the economy in Europe. I wonder whether they know whether the financial circles and the business circles have been fleeing Germany for the longest time, bound for Asia or the United States to shelter from this economic collapse of Germany, and they are still continuing. The authorities in Germany are still continuing to pump more money to Kiev. Paris is intending to ship an additional package of French fighters Mirage 2000 to Kiev and give them another 2 billion euros in military aid, including the missiles for the fighters and the ATGMs and armored cars, wheeled tanks, etc. There's an expression, at least we die with music, and the money that they send for the music that is playing along the process of the death of the European continent. The Scandinavian countries are trying to match the southern neighbors. For example, Sweden has announced the biggest shipment and package of aid, numbering around $1.6 billion. The aforementioned summit in Paris also featured discussions of the Franco-Briton initiative of deployment of some guarantee forces in Ukraine and not a peacekeeping contingent. I have an impression that all this is required just to completely fool their own citizens, and the European Union or the United Kingdom to completely baffle them by introducing new notions and new organizations and new plans. And the forces that they're planning to deploy in Ukraine will not be deployed in the territory of the line of contact and will not be replacing the AFU. Their idea behind the deployment is to protect the strategic points such as Odessa or Lvov, and that's been openly discovered from the statements in Paris and London. I have an impression that the Europeans are trying to protect the cities and have their own plans for them. This reminds me of the military intervention of Entente's force during the civil war in our country in 1917-1922. But we know our history well. And of course, the terrible history of the mobilization of Ukraine, the corruption and the arbitrary actions of the military commissariats was mentioned even by the Ukrainian ombudsman Dmitry Lubinets, who admitted the massive and systemic character of human rights violations and abuse of power. We see facts of use of force, weapons, and special equipment against those mobilized, and forced signature of documents, barring lawyers' access to the defendants, and the victims of the bussification. This verb, this noun meaning the forced packing of people into buses. Now we see that now ordinary bandits have taken the place of lawyers, and they are extorting money to save people from this trap. That's where the billions of dollars will go, billions of euros too. We see that the help you, help me attitude, that where the Kiev functionaries are continuing to drink the blood of ordinary Ukrainians and are still continuing to profit off the aid of the European Union. The facts are confirming the relevance of the special military operation whose goals will be accomplished, as was mentioned numerous occasions by leadership. Just see what happens around the destruction, not just the freedom of religious expression, that is a notion long gone in Ukraine, but around the destruction of Christianity in Ukraine. Last week, the fight for the appropriation of the Kiev Pechersk Lavra and its property and relics has resumed with new force. On the 5th of March, the Ministry of Culture for Ukraine, if we can call it a Ministry of Culture, based on executive order, has created a commission. One would think it would be to protect this heritage site, or just to create a dialogue. One would think that this would be the goal of the commission, but no. In the best practices, in the best traditions, the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, based on executive order, created a commission to, quote, inventorize and verify the availability of the remains of saints in the caves of the Lavra. Remember what the initiatives of Zelensky were regarding the settlement of the questions related to the Lavra. They called it decommunization. But no, even communists couldn't even come up with such an idea 100 years ago. There have been a lot of things done wrong, and we admit that, and we are speaking openly about that, but no one didn't even dare to do that, not even the most odious ones. The composition of the Commission on this verification of the historical and scientific value of the remains of saints, that's a direct quote, namely. This commission included the doctor of veterinary sciences, and it's just hard to hear it. A doctor of veterinarian sciences, the dean in the biomorphology department of vertebrates of the National University of Bioresources and Use of Nature of Ukraine, Oleg Melnik, was appointed as one of the members of the commission. Well, Nikolai Gogol, Saltykov, Shchedrin, Bulgakov or Zoshenko, all those authors, perhaps Shukhin too, would envy such a charade. And the number of experts that, together with the aforementioned person, have been taking part in the sacrilege, counted the numbers. The dean of the Department of Human Anatomy of the Odessa Medical University, then Apelhans, the professor of the Department of Anatomy of the Vinnytsia University, Yuri Guminsky, they just know we should know the anti-heroes of the situation. According to the document, the Commission should verify the existence of the remains of saints in the tombs, in the caves of the National Reserve of the Kiev Pechers Lavra until May 30th, and to evaluate their historical and scientific value. In case of discovery of new items in the category of cultural values, they should be included in a special list for further reporting. The Commission started its work on the morning of 20th of March, where the territory of the caves was breached by the members of the Commission, accompanied by the members of the law enforcement agencies. And they were planning to open up the caskets with the remains, to recount them, and use samples for DNA expertise. How's that decommunization going for you? And the members of the staff arrive with instruments to break the locks separating the caves. I don't know what stage this work is currently happening at, because the information was classified, introducing the special security clearance to all information related to this. What are those heritage items, heritage pieces that should be hidden from their own populace? They are hiding also the fact that every normal person, the things that every normal person would call sacrilege. We see this as a basic start of the planned ravaging and destruction of valuable items that are especially valuable for all Orthodox and Christian world. And 3 years ago, those relics have been started to be shipped out of the Kiev Pechers Lavra by the regime of Zelensky, and those relics were then sent to unknown destinations in Western countries. We see that Kiev is demonstrating that the neo-Nazi dictature has been oppressing the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has been stolen from now. It's not even getting into the pockets of the Ukrainian people now. They have been stealing the soul from the Ukrainian people by doing this. This act of blasphemy shouldn't be left without any attention from the international community. The relics of the saints are not museum exposition pieces. Certainly not an object for experimentation. I allow myself to quote the American lawyer Robert Amsterdam, who publicly stated the following. He counted the current actions as the state-sponsored desecration of the place that has been a spiritual center for almost a millennia. He pointed out that the raids organized by the government are a direct violation of the Ukrainian legislation and the norms of international law, representing, and I quote, alarming return to the tactics of religious persecution of the Soviet era. Once again, I would like to ask, how is the decolonization going? If we use international legal framework, then the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the World Cultural and Environmental Heritage of 1972 talks about the commitment of states to assist in the recognition, protection, preservation, popularization of the cultural and environmental heritage. There shouldn't be any actions, and I quote, that could harm directly or indirectly cultural and environmental heritage. As we see, the Kiev-Pечорsk Lavra is among the list of the place of heritage of worldwide heritage of UNESCO. There are corresponding protective verification, protective certificates that still exist, which wouldn't allow people to dehumanize and to act in such a dehumanizing manner. We have already provided them our moral evaluation, and it's not in favor of those who are trying to destroy the cultural and religious heritage of the canonical orthodoxy.
And of course, about another masquerade that is being prepared by the West, the history of Bucha. This year marks the 3rd anniversary of the neo-Nazi regime of Zelensky and its curator organizing the provocation in order to blame Russia for the war crimes against the civilians in Bucha. And we've repeatedly stated, using the facts, that the so-called massacre in Bucha is nothing but a staged effect, but Bankova and its curators do not give up any efforts to lay the blame on Russia for the bloody spectacle that they have orchestrated, doing anything in their power to discredit our country in the international information space. But that's not even their main goal. The main goal is to blow smoke under those who they're trying to attract into these bloody acts, those who they're trying to forcefully mobilize. This is where it's necessary. I would like to recall that in 1944, Nazis also blamed the Red Army for the so-called crimes against the civilian population after leaving the city Nemmersdorf. Later, historians have recognized this as the factual lie in order to present the Soviet soldiers in an unpleasant light. And today, on the same principles, they're trying to blame the Russian army for the so-called crimes in Bucha. Over 3 years, Russia has not been presented with a list of the victims in Bucha, although we've sent requests for identifying of those whose bodies were shown all over the world. In particular, since 2022, we have addressed to several UN structures in order to get from the Ukrainian side this list. On September 22nd, 2022, during the meeting of the Security Council of the UN, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, has addressed the subsequent demand to the Secretary General of the UN. And then the minister repeatedly reminded Mr. Guterres about his requests during personal meetings, during the phone calls, as well as making it public. In September 2024, the permanent representation of Russia in New York have passed over to the UN structure that prepared by the investigative committee on investigating by the Prosecutor General's office the request on the provocation in Bucha. And we've repeatedly called on the UN Secretariat to reply to this request, and still it remains without an answer. let's take a look at what exactly could help those at UN and anyone actually establish what happened then. Let's draw the lines of what doesn't add up. First, how could, as they state, bodies of those killed in the last days of February and the first days of March, as they state, how could those bodies remain unnoticed until early April? And their version operates on the fact that mass shootings of the civilians were perpetrated by the Russian militants in the first days after the city was captured. And I would like to say that Bucha was partially occupied by the Russian army at the end of February 2022. And the rest were in the beginning of March. And all those footage of evidence are referring to April. And yet you can see that there is no evidence of desiccating bodies. There is no damage to the bodies. There is no damage by animals. So remaining in this state unchanged until the spring of 22 would be impossible. When, where, and by whom were those crimes perpetrated? The modern criminology means, as well as the medical expertise, allow us to state the place of murder. Using the criminology artifacts, the remains of substances under the nails, the nature of worn-out clothes, as well as molecular traces. As for the evidence, as for when and where were these people killed, by whom, and they're being presented as the victims of Bucha, are nowhere to be found. And yet they're still saying that the Russian soldiers are to blame for it, and there's nothing to back this theory. Third, and this is the question that comes from the last one, when were these bodies brought from and for what purpose? If they were killed by the militants of the Kiev regime before, where were they preserved all this time? Medical expertise could help establish if those bodies were frozen or if they were brought to the city, abandoned by the Russian army after a few hours. This could also be backed by the lack of blood traces. Why between the messages of Russian troops leaving Bucha and the first evidence? Why were there 2-3 days between that? Russian army left Bucha on March 30th, some of them on March 31st. On the same day, the mayor of Bucha, Anatoly Fedoruk, has presented from the city. After that, the public deputy, Jan Belenuk, has presented it. If at least one of them saw on the central street, Yablonsky, all those bodies, the footage of which were spread across the Western mass media, I highly doubt they would stay silent about it. It would be one of the first things they were speaking about this fact. I would like to recall that only on April 1st, the 2nd, there were first reports on the shocking war crimes that took place in the city. But the answer is clear. Nothing of what the Western mass media tried to spread, nothing actually had taken place. Because otherwise, any representatives of the leadership giving commentary after Russian forces left the city, they would be describing it in detail, crying about it. And they would be right if those were their compatriots, their citizens, those they knew personally, if they live in that city, because they had to know those people. They would be quoting words of their families. They would know them by names. They would be sharing their stories. None of that was done. Not during the recording of the video message of the mayor of Bucha, nor afterwards. None of the aforementioned was even said out loud. What was the national police doing in the town on the morning of 2nd of April? According to the official statements, the national police, Bucha, tried to cleanse the town from all the diversions and all the complacence of Russia. But after that, the authorities stay silent about the fact. And finally, why most victims were wearing white stripes on their arms, on their hands. And in March 2022, most residents of the Kiev region, those who welcomed the Russian army, would like to present their peaceful intentions were wearing the white stripes, and the fact that most who died in Bucha had white stripes on their elbows. Some of them had their hands tied behind their backs. Speaks for the fact that it's the Ukrainian armed forces who tried to get rid of them after they entered Bucha. As for the quick exit of the Russian troops, a lot of them didn't have time to take them off. And after that, the territorial defense troops or the national police just shot those people point blank for trying to defend peace. There are a lot of other questions that could be asked. Why were there staged photographs being spread on social media? A lot of victims later turned out to be alive, and photographs of their bodies that were trying to be presented as dead bodies were spread during the first days of hysteria and later proved to be fake. Why was there no assessment of the possibility that at least some of the bodies, victims of the shelling of the Ukrainian armed forces that was conducted after Russian armed forces left the city, this version just didn't align with the narrative that the Westerners left so much. And they're not even considering this option, even though on those photos you see the traces of the strikes of the Kiev regime artillery. An important question that a lot of people are asking, that Russian militants opened humanitarian corridors in Bucha in order to let the civilians leave. That was confirmed by several witness statements of the citizens. So why did the potential victims, if they felt this threat, why did they not use those corridors? And perhaps the final question, the question that the Western journalists should ask themselves. Foreign mercenaries, including Philip Seman, who was found guilty of marauding in Prague, have openly admitted that they, including Seman, under the AFU control, took part in crimes against civilians in March-April 2022. So why did his statement get ignored as proof that Ukrainian armed forces tried to kill people in Bucha by using even other hands to do it? So everything that we're witnessing is another spectacle. And why is it being put to action right now? In order to pump this information into those civilians of Ukraine who continue to believe the Kiev regime. And once again, in order to provide this zombie information to the European citizens whose pockets they're raiding for the last remnants of billion to support the Kiev regime. This is what they need them for. And back then it was necessary to undermine the peaceful negotiations, peaceful agreements, in order to lead the region to the brink of battle. And right now, to undermine any negotiations pertaining to peace. And right now, to ensure multi-billion financing into Bankova. And let's take a look. What an interesting take. And how interesting they can blow out the information noise. And how interesting they're using the silence for similar scenarios, terrorist acts. And in the first case, this was a made-up case. And in the second case, there's a real case, the explosion in the Nord Streams. And it's been over 2.5 years since the terrorist acts on the objects. And so much time since this civilian energy project will be destroyed. Do you think any result has been achieved? Of course not. Dead silence. Meanwhile, they're putting up plays when it comes to Bucha. Let me recall the chronological order of events. On the night of 26th of September 2022, there was the lower pressure on one of the two streams of the Nord Stream 2. Immediately, they notified the border services of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Then we found out the event took place in the economical zone of Denmark. And the Swedish seismologists have noted on the 26th of September 2 explosions on the pipelines. And the Danish Energy Agency has reported that a lot of gas has reached the sea. After that, the Swedish Agency on Preserving the Environment has stated that about 5.8 million tons of malicious substances have been found in the atmosphere. On the 28th of September 2022, the Russian General Prosecutor's Office has started the class actions on the case of international terrorism. On the 30th of September 2022, the President of Russia has stated that the explosion is a diversion aimed at the destruction of the common European energy infrastructure. Germany, Denmark, and Sweden have stated their intention on conducting national investigation on the blowing up of the gas pipelines, but refused to include our country. In mid-October 2022, European mass media have published first photographs taken underwater of the blown pipeline. A month later, specialists of Gazprom and Nord Stream 2 AG representatives were allowed to take a look at those. On November 18, 2022, the fact of diversion was confirmed by Swedish special services. They even found remnants of the explosive devices. On February 8, 2023, the American journalist, who is the award recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, Seymour Hersh, who specializes in investigations, stated that the explosives were laid in June 2022 under the guise of the NATO training, Galtops 2022. The presence of the military Navy forces of the US. And according to this data, this operation was overseen by the President of the US, Joe Biden. In the European Commission press service, they've called these conclusions as nothing but speculations and refused to comment on them. The coordinator on strategic communications in the Council of National Security of the White House, John Kirby, stated that there is not a semblance of truth in this article and stated that the US is not responsible for those explosions. And he did not go into detail as for the Joe Biden's involvement. On February 21st, 2023, at Russia's request, the UN Security Council had a meeting devoted to the explosion of the gas pipelines. But the Russian project of resolution that proposed an international investigation under the guise of the UN Secretary General, but the Westerners blocked that project. On March 1st, 2nd, 2023, at the meeting of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the G20 in the Russian and Chinese side, tried to include in the final declaration mention of the explosions in the Nord Streams. But once again, the Western states have refused these initiatives. On March 7th, 2023, the New York Times newspapers, stating the American officials stated that diversifications at the pipelines could be conducted by the pro-Ukrainian grouping that acted without the knowledge of the Ukrainian authorities. So where exactly does Joe Biden's statement on the destruction of civilian infrastructure fit into this? Of the civilian infrastructure object, which he publicly spoke about in the early 22. And the edition D side also had a publication that the German investigators have located a ship that was used by the diversant, and the company that allocated it belonged to the citizens of Ukraine and was registered in Poland. And we all remember this miraculous story about the luxurious yacht that was tried to be posed by the Western mass media as the main version of events. And on March 8, 2023, the Times newspaper informed that European intelligence services know the name of a private sponsor of the diversification. Of course,